Can you imagine a single act of kindness changing the course of an entire life? A black waiter fed 2 orphans, and 20 years later, a helicopter appeared in front of his house. The noise of the propellers cut through the morning silence like a razor. Thomas Jefferson Santos, 45 years old, was washing dishes in the sink of his small house when the whole neighborhood stopped to look at the black helicopter landing right in front of his gate. 2 elegant figures stepped out of the aircraft. A tall man in an impeccable suit and a woman of noble bearing, both walking directly toward his door. Thomas dried his hands slowly, a serene expression taking over his face, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. 20 years earlier, Thomas was just another black waiter trying to survive at the Golden Fork, a fine dining establishment where customers barely looked at his face when placing their orders. At that time, he was 25 years old and working double shifts, mornings as a janitor, afternoons and evenings as a waiter to support his sick mother. It was on a cold December night that it all began. 2 orphan children, a 10-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl, appeared shivering at the back door of the restaurant. Eli and Nina, he would later learn, had lost their parents in an accident and had been living on the streets for weeks. Thomas did something that would change their lives forever. He began sneaking food to them every night. The restaurant manager, Robert Manning, a 50-year-old white man with a superiority complex, discovered Thomas's charity after 3 weeks. "Do you think this is a free food distribution center?" he shouted, firing Thomas in front of all the employees. "You clueless black man, you should be grateful you have a job, not giving our food to bums." Thomas left silently, but continued to feed the children with what little he had at home. Until one day they simply disappeared, taken away by social services to a distant institution. What if the man you humiliated turned out to be the mastermind behind your downfall? Now, 20 years later, as he watched those 2 elegant figures approaching, Thomas allowed himself a smile. During all those years working in modest jobs, being underestimated and humiliated, he kept a secret that no one could have imagined. If you're wondering what 2 orphan street children have to do with a helicopter landing at the door of a former waiter, get ready to discover how small acts of kindness can create twists and turns that no one can predict. If this story is touching your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what you're about to discover will completely change your perspective on revenge and justice. The humiliation at the Golden Fork was just the beginning. Robert Manning wasn't satisfied with firing Thomas. He made sure to spread the word around town that the problem waiter had been caught stealing food. Strategic phone calls to other restaurants ensured that Thomas was blacklisted from any decent establishment. "You have to understand one thing about people like him," Manning explained to the other owners over lunch at the private club. "Give them an inch and they'll take a mile. I thought I was doing charity by hiring a black guy, but they always show their true colors." Meanwhile, Thomas scoured the city for any job. Car washes, flyer delivery, cleaning offices in the wee hours of the morning. Anything that paid a few dollars. His mother, Mrs. Ruth, watched her son come home later and later, his clothes dirty and his pride bruised. "My son," she whispered as she tended to his bandages, diabetic for years. She depended on Thomas for everything. "You have so much more inside you than this town can see." And she was right. What Manning and the others didn't know was that Thomas had graduated from the state university with a degree in business administration with top marks. He worked as a waiter not because he had no other options, but because he needed flexible hours to take care of his mother. For years, he kept his diploma in a drawer, accepting that the world saw him as just another disposable employee. But the children changed something inside him. Even after he was fired, even when he was hungry at times, Thomas continued to bring food to Eli and Nina. He sold personal belongings, took humiliating extra jobs, anything to make sure those 2 little ones didn't go to bed hungry. It was on one of those nights, carrying a bag of leftovers from a wedding he had helped clean up, that Thomas heard familiar voices coming from the private club. Manning was on the porch with other businessmen, drinking whiskey and laughing loudly. "Did you see that? The thief waiter is still out there picking up scraps like a stray dog." Manning laughed, pointing in the direction Thomas was walking. I bet he's selling the stolen food to buy drugs. It's always the same story with these types. Thomas stopped. For a moment he felt his blood boil. He could cross the street, climb those marble steps, and show those men exactly who he really was. He could pull his diploma out of his pocket and rub it in each of their faces. But then he thought of Eli and Nina, probably waiting for him in the cold alley. He took a deep breath, adjusted the bag of food on his shoulder, and kept walking. Manning and his friends laughed even louder, interpreting his silence as submission. They had no idea what a mistake they were making. That same night, after feeding the children, Thomas sat down in the small room he shared with his mother and opened an old notebook. He began to write names, dates, conversations he had overheard at the Golden Fork. During months of waiting tables, he had absorbed valuable information about business, tax schemes, even some racist comments that customers made, thinking he was invisible. One day, he muttered to himself, "You'll find out you underestimated the wrong person." 3 weeks later, Eli and Nina simply disappeared. Thomas searched everywhere until he found out they had been taken to an orphanage in another state. He tried to visit them, but was barred. No relatives, no visitation rights. That was the last straw. Thomas realized that dreaming of justice wasn't enough. He had to build it with his own hands. What those privileged men couldn't see was that every insult, every closed door, every denied opportunity was forging something far more dangerous than a disgruntled waiter. It was creating a strategist who knew their weaknesses better than they knew themselves, and who now had every motivation in the world to use that knowledge against them. Over the next 2 years, while Manning celebrated his victory over the problem waiter, Thomas was building something none of them could have imagined. Working 16 hours a day at jobs that barely paid the rent, he used every free minute to put everything he had learned in college into practice. The notebook turned into detailed spreadsheets. The conversations he had overheard at the Golden Fork revealed a disturbing pattern. Manning and his club friends weren't just racist. They were habitual tax evaders. Decades of overpriced contracts, off-the-books employees, manipulated receipts. Thomas had names, dates, exact amounts. His mother died on a rainy Tuesday, holding her son's hand and whispering, "Don't let the anger consume you, boy. Use this pain to build something greater." Thomas promised her, right there in the public hospital bed where they had waited 6 hours for treatment, that he would do just that. It was at Mrs. Ruth's funeral that Thomas met Dr. Marcus Chun, a tax lawyer who had been a college classmate of Thomas's mother decades earlier. Chun was the son of Chinese immigrants, and knew well the bitter taste of prejudice disguised as professional standards. "Your mother spoke of you," Chun said, handing him his card. "She said you had the potential for great things, but that the world was trying to convince you otherwise." Thomas showed Chun his notes. The lawyer leafed through the pages silently, his eyes widening with each revelation. "This is a tax bomb," he muttered. "If half of this information is true, it's all true," Thomas interrupted. "I was there when they said it. They thought I was furniture." Chun closed the notebook slowly. "You have 2 options. Hand this over to the IRS and hope they investigate. Or we build a case so solid they have no choice but to act." Meanwhile, Manning had expanded his business. He bought 2 competing restaurants, always following the same pattern. Mostly white employees in prominent positions, minimum wages for the others, contracts that existed only on paper. His arrogance grew in proportion to the size of his bank account. "Did you see that the thief waiter became a janitor?" Manning laughed during a business lunch. "Karma works. People like that need to know their place in the world." What Manning didn't know was that the janitor now cleaned the building where his accounting office was located 3 times a week, and that during those months, Thomas had photographed hundreds of documents, copied entire spreadsheets, and recorded compromising conversations through the thin walls. Chun was impressed with Thomas's methodology. "You should have been a detective," he joked, organizing the evidence into themed folders. "This is professional investigative work." "I had good teachers," Thomas replied, remembering the scientific methodology classes he had taken seriously in college. The difference is that now I have personal motivation. The turning point came when Thomas discovered that Manning was planning an even bigger expansion, a chain of restaurants financed by international investors. The project depended on a flawless public image and strict government certifications. It's now or never, Chun said, tapping his fingers on the desk in his small office. If we let him close those deals, he'll be too protected to attack. Thomas looked out the office window, watching the movement of the city that had so underestimated him. At that moment, he no longer felt like the humiliated waiter of 2 years ago. He felt like the strategist he had always been beneath the surface. He believes he destroyed me, he said, turning to Chun with a smile that mixed determination and a hint of righteous vengeance. He has no idea that he just gave me time to prepare properly. Chun nodded, recognizing in his partner's eyes the same hunger for justice that had motivated him throughout his career. Then it's time to show him who really knows how to play this game. The plan was ready. The evidence was organized. The right contacts had been identified. Thomas took a deep breath, remembering his mother's words about turning pain into building. Manning had completely underestimated the power of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. For months, everyone saw only a quiet janitor cleaning offices. What they didn't realize was that they were watching a strategist gathering ammunition for a war Manning didn't even know was about to begin. The first crack in Manning's confidence appeared on a Tuesday in March when his chief accountant called in a panic. "Mr. Manning, there's an IRS audit here. They're asking for documents from the last 5 years. Manning laughed, adjusting his Italian tie as he watched the city from his 20th floor office window. Routine, Peterson. We're a solid company. Show them our books. Sir, they're not asking for the official books. They have copies of documents I've never seen. Detailed spreadsheets, payment records that shouldn't exist." Manning's smile froze. "What do you mean they shouldn't exist? They know about the ghost employees, the overpriced contracts. Even that account in the Cayman Islands you said was top secret." Across town, Thomas was in his small apartment watching the morning news when his phone rang. It was Chun, barely able to contain his satisfaction. "It started," he said simply. "The IRS accepted our complaint and acted faster than we expected. They're going after everything, Thomas. 5 years of chronologically organized evidence." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, remembering his mother. "She would be proud," he murmured. "But that's just the beginning." The Department of Justice has also been notified, and the Health Department has received an interesting dossier on working conditions in Manning's restaurants. The second crack came 2 days later. Manning was meeting with the international investors who would finance his expansion when his assistant rushed into the conference room in a panic. "Mr. Manning? There are journalists at the reception desk. They're asking about allegations of slave labor and tax evasion. The local newspaper is going to publish a story tomorrow." The CEO of the investors, a strict German named Herr Schmidt, frowned. "What is this, Manning? Our company does not associate with questionable operations." "It's a misunderstanding," Manning stammered, feeling sweat trickle down his back. "A disgruntled former employee, probably you know how it is." But when the newspaper came out the next day, there was no misunderstanding. The front page story featured photos, documents, and detailed testimonials. The headline was devastating. "Food empire built on exploitation and tax evasion. The truth behind Manning's restaurants." The report revealed everything. Black employees being paid half the salary of white employees for the same jobs. Degrading working conditions. Elaborate tax evasion schemes. But what was most shocking was a recording obtained by an anonymous source in which Manning was clearly heard saying, "Negroes have to know their place. I pay the minimum wage because that's all they deserve." Manning called the newspaper in a rage. "Where did you get this? It's a setup. This is persecution." "Mr. Manning," the reporter replied calmly, "we have dozens of hours of recordings, hundreds of documents, and testimony from 42 former employees. Would you like to comment? The third crack destroyed everything. Investors canceled the contract immediately. The bank froze the company's accounts. 3 of the restaurants had their licenses suspended by the health department. Employees began suing the company en masse. It was during an emergency meeting with his lawyers in a conference room that now looked like an interrogation chamber that Manning received the call that would change everything. Hello? Who is this? Hi, boss. The voice was calm, polite, with a slight tone of irony that Manning couldn't immediately identify. Who is this? Thomas Jefferson Santos. Remember me? The waiter you fired 3 years ago for feeding orphan children? The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. The lawyers watched Manning gradually turn pale. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. How did I get all this information? Thomas smiled, looking out the window of his new office, small but honest. Did you really think a man with a degree in business and straight A's would sit idly by after being publicly humiliated? That's impossible. You're a janitor. I was for 3 years. I cleaned offices, including the building where your accounting department is located. Do you know how many private conversations can be heard through thin walls? How many documents are left on desks when the invisible are cleaning? Manning felt his legs go weak. He signaled for the lawyers to leave the room, but they hesitated, realizing that something crucial was happening. You recorded private conversations. That's a crime. Crime is evading millions in taxes. Crime is paying black employees half the salary for equal work. Crime is creating a work environment based on racial humiliation. Thomas's voice remained calm. I just documented the truth. What do you want? Money? I can pay. Thomas laughed softly. Mr. Manning, you still don't understand. I don't want anything from you because I already have everything I need. What are you talking about? You know that account in the Cayman Islands that you thought was secret? The IRS already has the statements. Those overpriced contracts with shell companies? They're already in the hands of the district attorney's office. And those recordings where you talk about teaching blacks their place? They've just been sent to all the local television stations. Manning almost dropped the phone. That will destroy me completely. No, Mr. Manning, you destroyed yourself. I just documented the process. At that moment, his assistant rushed into the room. Mr. Manning, your employees are quitting en masse. The union is at the door and there's a TV crew wanting an interview. Manning covered the phone with his hand. Tell them I'm not here. They said they have recordings of you and can publish them without your side of the story if you prefer. Mr. Manning? Thomas's voice was still on the line. Are you still there? Why are you doing this to me? Manning whispered, defeated. Because you made a choice 3 years ago. You chose to humiliate a man who was trying to feed hungry children. You chose to spread lies about me to ensure that I would never find decent work again. You chose to treat human beings like disposable trash. Manning looked out the window of his office, watching the crowd gather in front of the building. Cameras, microphones, posters with words he couldn't read from up there, but he could imagine the content. I was just a businessman trying to protect my business. And I was just a son trying to take care of his sick mother. The difference between us, Mr. Manning, is that I never had to step on other people to get what I wanted. That afternoon, when the last employees left the office carrying boxes with their personal belongings, Manning was left alone in the empty room. His secretary had resigned by email. His accountant had disappeared without a trace. Even the building doorman greeted him coldly. Across town, Thomas received a call from Chun. The German investors want to talk to you. They're impressed with your investigative methodology. Apparently, they're looking for someone with your skills for internal auditing. Thomas smiled, remembering his mother's words about turning pain into building. Manning had tried to break his spirit, but he had only forged something stronger. On television that night, images of the fall of the Manning Empire dominated the news. Employees gave emotional testimonials about years of discrimination. Experts explained how tax evasion affected essential public services. And at the center of it all was the question no one could answer. Who was the anonymous source who had obtained such devastating evidence? Manning, watching from his empty apartment, the mansion had been repossessed by the bank that morning, knew exactly who it was. The waiter he had fired like a bug had become the architect of his complete ruin. As Manning contemplated the ruins of his arrogance, one question remained: could the fall of an empire built on prejudice teach us anything about the true price of humility? And when the ashes settled, who would truly emerge victorious from this silent war waged in the shadows of injustice? 6 months after the fall of the Manning Empire, Thomas was in his new office, no longer the small but honest space, but an elegant penthouse in the city's financial center. The auditing firm he had founded with Chun was growing exponentially, specializing in investigating discriminatory labor practices in large corporations. Ironically, the Manning case had become a famous case study in business schools on how meticulous documentation and strategic patience could bring down seemingly untouchable systems. Thomas gave lectures at universities, always telling the same story. The best revenge is not destroying your enemy, it's building something he could never imagine. Manning, on the other hand, had lost everything. Bankrupt, his reputation destroyed. He now worked as a night manager at a gas station on the outskirts of town. His former friends from the private club greeted him coldly when they occasionally ran into him. His arrogance had been replaced by a quiet bitterness and the belated realization that he had completely underestimated the wrong man. News of his downfall had been circulating for months. $1 million lawsuits, federal investigations, even a congressional inquiry into discrimination in the food service industry. Manning had become the national symbol of how systematic prejudice could destroy not only innocent lives, but the very perpetrators of that injustice. It was on a sunny Thursday that Thomas heard the sound of helicopter blades. He was reviewing contracts when his assistant rushed in. "Mr. Santos, there's a helicopter landing on the building's helipad. 2 people are asking to speak with you." Thomas smiled, as if he had been expecting this moment. 20 years had passed since he last saw Eli and Nina, but something in his heart always knew that their paths would cross again. When the elevator doors opened, he recognized them immediately. Eli was now an elegant businessman, owner of a chain of ethical restaurants that specifically employed people in vulnerable social situations. Nina had become a renowned human rights lawyer specializing in cases of racial discrimination. "Thomas," Eli said, extending his hand with a smile that mixed gratitude and admiration. "We knew we'd meet again someday." "You've grown up," Thomas replied, moved. "And you've become exactly what I knew you would be." Nina opened a folder and showed them newspaper clippings, online articles, and reports on the Manning case. "We followed everything. When we saw your name in the news, we knew immediately who you were. The man who fed us when we were children became the man who brought down an empire built on prejudice," Eli added. It was no coincidence. The 3 talked for hours. Eli told them how he had built his restaurant chain, always keeping in mind the lessons Thomas had taught him about dignity and caring for the most vulnerable. Nina explained how every case she won in court was a tribute to the man who had shown her that kindness and strategy could go hand in hand. "You know, we always kept that drawing we made for you," Nina said, pulling a yellowed, carefully preserved piece of paper from her bag. "It was the same figure in the middle of the storm, protecting 2 children, but now framed with love and reverence." Thomas hugged them both, feeling that a circle had been perfectly closed. "You know I did that for you too, right? Every document I photographed, every recording I made was with the children who might go through what you went through in mind." Nina pulled another document from the folder. "Actually, we came here with a proposal. We want to create a foundation together. Programs that identify at-risk children and connect them with real opportunities for growth, and restaurants that serve as vocational training centers," Eli added. "Places where people like us, and like you once were, can find not just work, but dignity. We have interested investors, government support, and a network of business people who want to participate," Nina added. "But we need someone who understands that social justice isn't just talk. It's concrete, strategic action." That afternoon, as the three planned the future of the foundation, Thomas looked out the panoramic window of his office. Below, the city moved at its usual pace, full of people struggling, dreaming, facing their own injustices. Manning was still somewhere in the city, probably brooding over his defeat and trying to understand how he had been beaten by someone he considered inferior. But Thomas no longer felt anger, only a quiet satisfaction at having proven that intelligence, patience, and integrity always defeat arrogance and prejudice. 2 years later, the Santos Ilanina Foundation had become a national benchmark in the fight against discrimination and for social inclusion. More than 500 children had already benefited from educational programs. 2,000 families had received free legal advice, and 8 new restaurant schools were operating in different states. Thomas appeared regularly in the media, no longer as the humiliated waiter, but as the brilliant strategist who had completely changed the paradigm of how to fight corporate injustice. His auditing firm became the nightmare of prejudiced businessmen across the country. During an interview on national television, the host asked, "Mr. Santos, what would you say to people who are experiencing discrimination similar to yours?" Thomas smiled, adjusting the suit he now wore with ease. "That the difference between revenge and justice is simple. Revenge destroys, justice builds. Manning tried to destroy me, but he ended up teaching me that I could be much greater than he ever imagined." The best revenge had been exactly what his mother always said: turn pain into building. Manning tried to break Thomas, but only forged him into something stronger. And now every child helped by the foundation was a new victory over all the Mannings in the world. If this story of transformation and justice touched your heart, leave a comment about how you would react in a similar situation. Have you ever faced prejudice at work? How did you deal with it? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you, it's building something greater than they could ever imagine. Because in the end, success always speaks louder than any insult.